Yeah, so welcome. These bots you can see here are GPT-4, by the way, Rishni.
Oh, cool.
Yes, I think I remember reading that somewhere.
Yeah. Alright, just give me one sec.
Do they do anything in particular?
They can hear us when we're speaking, not yet, but they will in a moment, and they will react and kind of offer their thoughts on the conversation as we're going.
Oh, okay.
One of them, Triku, will compose haiku. You can see them going there, yeah.
So you you use the Whisper API?
It's just the Google voice to text API, which isn't as good as Whisper, so I'll switch it over at some point. But
Right. Oh, there you go. I just saw a haiku.
yeah. How are you, Adam? It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. I'm better now. I had a rough month, but definitely better now.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I guess I'm still signing in with the other account for the bots to hear us, but before we get started, maybe I can briefly introduce Rishni. So Rishni's crowning achievement in life was to be my best man. Apart from that, he's kind of kicked around and other things. So he did a PhD at the same time as me at ANU in math, and then after that went on to teach for a while, and then was driving herds of analysts at McKinsey, and then running an online education spin out from the University of New South Wales, and now he's started a company. You want to add to that, Rish?
No, that's a good intro. I'm amazed you remembered everything.
What's the company?
It's generative AI. Effectively, I'm not sure if you saw like Andreessen Horowitz's post like a few days ago about this theory of the next phase of AI is what they call synth AI. So generative AI being creating new content, and synth AI being about taking the multitude of existing content out there and converting into meaning for people. We're sort of doing that for strategic decision making in business.
Very cool. Very cool. Awesome.
Okay, the bots can hear us now. Okay, I think we should get started. So welcome everybody. It's been about a month since we had a disruption seminar. The last one was on the 16th of March. It feels like a year ago. I guess plenty of things have happened over the last month. We'll discuss some of them. So the obvious things I think to talk about briefly are the pause letter, the mainstreaming of AI safety as a topic of discussion, and sort of attendant commentary from both accelerationist and more precautionary camps. Timelines have updated a lot for the public. So in previous seminars, we've talked about the view that different groups in society have about what's coming and how that's changed as a result of ChatGPT and GPT-4. And I've sort of been asking our acquaintances and friends, in the playground and elsewhere, whether they're aware of these things and what they think about them. And maybe you have too, and we could talk about that. What else do we want to table for the discussion today, Adam?
Well, that sounds pretty good. I mean, as you said, a huge amount of things are happening every week, and it is difficult to keep up with them. I mean, I have a hard enough time following any of the technical detail, on the best of days, and so I'm happy to discuss anything. I do agree that we could return to this topic of what the right strategy, what the most prudent strategy is for safety and alignment in the context of this very public call to halt or slow down certain types of research. I think that that's definitely an interesting topic. I'm also very interested in learning from you guys, who are much more expert than I am, what your assessment of recent progress is, especially the multimodal developments that have happened in the context of GPT-4, obviously, and then more broadly than that, what strikes me as a sudden surge in attempts to integrate tooling, multiple types of tooling, and multiple forms of tooling together with, in particular, GPT-4, but other language models as well. Because I'm trying to get just a general sort of 35,000 foot view of what that looks like and what we might expect to emerge from those efforts. Is this likely to lead to more emergent capability, or is just throwing a bunch of tools in a toolbox and shaking the case not going to yield new and better capability? I'm very interested in getting a sense of that from you much more expert folks than me. So those would be things that I'd love to talk about, but the list is very long. I mean, we've got a lot of catching up to do, and it does feel like there's a year of progress every week. At the moment, it's completely crazy. I guess another question that we could add to the list is: can this continue? Is it likely to continue? Are we? I mean, there's been a sudden surge, but are we going to level off at some new plateau? Is that looking likely, or is it just to the moon from here?
Yeah, Rishni, Matt, you want to add anything to that long list of things to discuss over the next 4 hours? I mean, 1.5 hours.
No, that sounds like a great set of topics, and very much aligned with the things that are on my mind. I mean, trying to build actually practical use cases for customers to use in this space, and that pace of change is a little bit crazy, because it's like every week there's a new competitor that's using that new tool, and it's like, oh my god, what am I going to do? So yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. Okay, let's start with timelines then. So I've been, let me think of one example. So a couple of weeks ago, we went out one Sunday with some family friends. They have a child Russell's age, and they were playing on the beach, and the parents were discussing, and I was talking to the father, and he works for Amazon AWS in Australia, and has been paying attention recently to ChatGPT and such things, and is using it for coding. And it was interesting to talk with him, because I think before the end of last year, he just hadn't paid attention really to AI at all. I mean, it's sort of been on the periphery, like with everybody. He's sort of vaguely aware of there being progress, but he hadn't really mapped it onto his thinking about the future of his child, or his own future, his own job. And that completely changed over the course of the last 3 or 4 months. So now I
remember, Dan, you and I had a beer in Sydney. It must have been like 2 or 3 years ago, just after GPT-3 came out. And you were like, this thing is amazing. And I went and had a look at it, and I was like, meh. But like, all they did was fine tune it for ChatGPT, and it just went completely insane, right?
More or less, yeah. So yeah, I think his timelines are more accelerated than mine. So I'm kind of on the record here as saying that I think probably my 50%, my estimate of the median time to AGI is something like 10 years. I think it's not imminent, but I mean, who knows, right? It could certainly be imminent. Any time from now, probably it's possible, but I think it may take some time. So I'm not really expecting there to be an automated scientist at the level of the greatest scientist that's ever lived for 10 years. There will be many more things before that, but I already think of that as pretty dramatic, to put it mildly. But I feel like some of the people I talk to in the public who haven't been paying attention until recently have basically updated to even more aggressive timelines than mine. So he said to me literally, I've heard people say that we're going to have, I'm not sure if he actually used the term AGI, but something equivalent by 2030. And then he said, yeah, but I think it might come sooner than that. So I think it's interesting that we discussed timelines in the seminar some months ago, and we sort of divided the world into three categories roughly. We talked about the tech insiders and them being exposed to the technology first, and then many of them having pretty short timelines. We talked about the elites, so people in economics, political elites, business people, them sort of paying attention, but maybe having at best medium timelines, the metric we used last time was medium was about 2040, short timelines was 2030, and long timelines was just 2100 or never. And we put the public at never or 2100 basically because we just thought people weren't paying attention. And I kind of expected, and I think you guys probably agreed, that the public, when they paid attention, would update first to medium timelines and then maybe to short timelines, but then that would be complete chaos. But I feel like in discussions with people, in some sense, if they're asked to give a prediction, many of them will basically have already jumped to short timelines. I don't know if that's really mapping onto their behavior. But I'm interested to get your take on what your discussions with other people sort of indicate in terms of timeline updates.
Well, I think it's really interesting. I'll share one fun sort of anecdote from earlier this week from my team that kind of adds a little color to the timeline question, which is the I think some nuance is now emerging as well. So there's timeline to what? Question mark, and it's in the early weeks and months following sort of the ChatGPT revolution as a revelation. I'm not sure how you might want to characterize that, but late last fall, following the sudden surge of interest, I think we went from a very low resolution picture of what the prospect looking forward might be and what a fast versus a slow timeline might be, but with only very dimly, poorly defined, low resolution sort of vision of what that entails. So there's something to do with artificial general intelligence. There's something to do with artificial superintelligence. There's something to do with systems that maybe are extremely competent, hyper competent perhaps, but are not necessarily agentic or sentient. And then below all of that stuff, which still seems, I think, like science fiction to a lot of people, there is this whole idea that, well, geez, just GPT-based technology, just the large language models, and the in particular the ability to operate as an assistant to accelerate and enhance productivity of people, and perhaps put certain types of knowledge workers out of work with writing or editing or summarizing or reviewing, doing quite repetitive intellectual work. That is now, I think, coming into clearer focus as, that might arrive much sooner than the public policymakers and perhaps even experts and technical folks might have been expecting. So there are multiple sort of things, there are multiple milestones and multiple socially and economically significant developments that may have a longer or shorter timeline. The story I'd like to share just very quickly is not about the generally intelligent or super intelligent things, but rather about these new tools as accelerants on productivity, as just basically catalyzing productivity. I've been telling my team for quite a while now, since Dan originally shared with me the significance of the transformer breakthrough several years ago, and then of course since the fall, I've been just badgering my team about, okay, we have to adopt these tools sooner rather than later. We have to be early adopters because they are going to turbocharge our productivity. And it's been mostly theoretical. I haven't used the tools to a great extent, and I've had a very rough month. I was planning on becoming an early adopter this month, and I haven't had a chance yet. But one of my teammates did it for me. Great guy, Brad. He's actually been to one of these disruption seminars. And earlier in the week, we had a big team meeting with the founders and the CEO and all of that stuff. and we went around telling everybody what we were up to. And Brad was able to say, well, I just started using GPT-4, and I've got a large corpus of work. We've got more than 100 case studies and 160,000 words worth of research. And I was planning on turning it into a book. And I've been working on it, and I've got a draft. But I started using GPT-4, and now I'm working on 7 books. And 2 of them are done. I finished one over the weekend. And he just hit the team with that yesterday. And in that moment, it suddenly became very real to my bosses what this technology is likely to do for teams like mine in terms of, as I said, just absolutely turbocharging productivity. So that's just a fun example of how people who are, I would call the group of people who I collectively call my bosses, they're experts in their own domains, and they're certainly elites, but they're not technically minded with respect to this particular technology. I could tell in real time did a massive timeline update as a result of just that quick conversation, and one of the people on the team saying, "Yep, I just 10x'd my productivity over the weekend," basically, or maybe more. So yeah, this is becoming very real very quickly for folks.
So Rish had an interesting take on the impact on consultancies. You want to share that, Rish? What do you think? Is there going to be a McKinsey in the future, or is it just 100? I mean, is it 100 times more effective, or is it just like redundant? We can't hear you, Rish. Maybe there's an audio issue. Yeah. Yeah, all right. Yeah, that's interesting. I've been hearing, so I tutor.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yep.
I just decided to switch my microphone again. I don't know why. Okay, so just sharing a few thoughts since I just wasted 30 seconds of your time. First thing is, one of the things I think has changed in the public perception, but if you were thinking about it, not yours, which is the impact on knowledge workers, people that have analytical skills. Most people, I think, probably 6-12 months ago would have said that AI is going to impact lowly skilled workers first, lowly trained, lowly qualified workers first. And I think it's reasonably clear with the new language models, you can see this from OpenAI's publicized research, that your lawyers and doctors and professional services like consultants are actually going to be heavily impacted probably sooner than, or as soon as some of the lower skilled workers. So that's sort of the first insight. The second insight is actually just reflecting on some of the comments a moment ago. You mentioned that one of your colleagues had sort of gone from writing 1 book to now writing 7. This actually speaks to what I said at the start about increase of outputs and increase of volumes of content. I would sort of argue that what we're seeing is an increase in output, but not necessarily an increase in productivity. In some cases, like software engineering, clearly an increase in productivity, but we're also seeing a big increase in output. But like, if everybody's writing 7 books a week, like who's reading those 7 books?
GPT-4, of course.
Yeah, saturation is coming. That's for sure. If it isn't already.
Well, what happens is people take those books, stick them in GPT-4, and say, "Give me a summary." You know, like they just do the opposite.
Exactly.
So that's like a really interesting thing, and that's why I think there's an interesting space here about how do we deal with this massive increase of outputs that's sort of happening. And maybe the third insight is that I really don't actually know how public perception is changing, because I try and think about it broadly. So, you know, I speak to a lot of people in the corporate world, and a lot of them are kind of saying, we're watching this, but we're not really executing on it yet. I suspect if you head out to Western Sydney and you talk to some of the people out in Parramatta Way, they're probably not even really aware, other than a few headlines like I think there's a diversity of awareness and a diversity in changing of timelines. And I just really don't know how it's actually playing out amongst the non-educated public on this topic.
It's going to be interesting to see these tools roll out and to see the dynamics and the incentives, which. Well, I should back up. I'm sort of diving in the middle in this thought here. I think there are interesting sets of incentives that differ for employees, for employers, for governments, and different types of organizations. So institutions and bureaucracies versus private businesses versus employees or workers for those businesses. And the value of these tools is different for those various stakeholders, and some of the interests come into conflict quite clearly between those groups. And I think some of that conflict is likely to be exacerbated. It's likely to be intensified as a result of these technologies. One very clear example, I think, is that as has happened with previous technologies that empower and enable productivity among workers, that gives workers a kind of leverage, but especially in the early days when it's not completely legible, it's not completely clear, it's not completely evident or obvious that that's the case. And in this particular instance where it affects knowledge workers, and even more so where those workers, because of the pandemic and technology progress in general over the last couple of decades, there's a huge amount of remote work now remote knowledge work that didn't exist, a generation earlier. And so I think we've got a sort of interim period here where there's potential for a lot of strong incentives to maintain opacity rather than transparency about the adoption of these tools from among these different stakeholders. So workers are not necessarily going to want to reveal that if they're working from home, they can get the same amount of work done in an hour that used to take an entire day, for example.
Yeah.
But obviously those incentives are misaligned with employers and so on. So there are interesting dynamics that are going to emerge as a result of this in the short term, and not just in a straightforward sense. So this is just going to make everybody and everything more productive, and a few people are going to be put out of work. I think it's quite a bit more complicated than that. We've talked about some of this stuff in the past, but I think we're likely to see a very rich and diverse ecosystem of adoption and application of this new technology, not just because it has such a wide variety of different capabilities, but because there's such a wide variety of sets of incentives and conflicting interests that are just, as I said, exacerbated by these new tools. So I think it will cut.
Coming to the topic of timelines, you sort of raised something really interesting there, which is when you look at the research on the productivity increase on some of these things, it's quite material. They take software engineers, double-digit percentage productivity increase. I can't remember the last time that we as a society have had such a productivity increase over such a short period of time. And what's not clear to me is how do people's perceptions of productivity, how are they going to change with that? So you raised a really interesting point, like at what point are employers going to expect software engineers just to write a lot more code faster? And if you're not performing at that speed, then you're underperforming as a software engineer. Currently, businesses have a certain expectation about how long it takes to write software. That's going to change. But there hasn't been a situation where we've had this massive step change happening all at once. So, how is that going to play out? It's a really great point.
Yeah, and I guess you might have expected that it would be, as with many technologies, it's new entrants or startups that sort of adopt it early and sort of drive adoption. But in this case, Microsoft has been so aggressive with integrating GPT-4 across its Office suite that it's almost the reverse, where you have like the poster child for the boring incumbent in tech is actually the one kind of moving fast and looking.
Yeah.
Well, and then also, the as opposed to businesses and business owners having incentive to adopt new technologies and try to carve out new competitive niches and disrupt old ones. Uh, Again, as I said, we have an unusual situation. I don't think it's entirely unprecedented, but certainly rare, where tools make employees more productive, and that empowers them in a way that stands at odds with the interests of the organizations they work for, in some sense. And again, I don't think this is entirely without precedent, but it's quite extraordinary, and I don't think we've seen the sort of qualitative magnitude of the productivity increase, like Rich was saying. Maybe we've had modest increases in the past, but I think there are certain types of work. Software is probably not a good example, but certainly there are kinds of work where you can absolutely 2, 5, 10, 20x your output with these tools in the near term before the curtain gets pulled back and the show is the trick is revealed, as it were. An easy example that comes to mind is transcription work. I mean, people still get paid to transcribe audio recordings and video recordings, and that was not a terrible. It was certainly better than minimum wage paying job. I've had to do it. It's kind of grueling in a scientific context for certain types of social science research, but that can be absolutely be very highly automated now, and it's not because of the transcription per se, the voice recognition. It's because sloppy transcripts that are verbatim can be cleaned up and turned into legible text, which wasn't possible in the past. That was what human beings were doing. You would typically do at least in the last 10 or 15 years, you would typically do a voice recognition pass and get some text file as output, but it would be rubbish. And then you'd have to go through it manually and polish it up into complete sentences with punctuation and so forth. And GPT can do that flawlessly at this point. And that I mean, that is going to, very quickly put people out of work. That's true. But in the short term, individuals who adopt very early are going to seem like they have just superpowers. And that's just one example. So I think we're in this strange interim period. And so on the one hand, the public may be thinking, well, the timeline has just telescoped forward massively. These things that seem like they were decades away, they're here or they're right around the corner. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, geez, if you've got a hustle going, don't let the cat out of the bag about it. If somebody interviews you and said, how long until you're out of work and you don't you're not going to, why would you spoil the ride? Why would you ruin the party? So I think that there's, again, some incentives that are mismatched against the clear recognition of what these AI timelines are. And so it would very much depend on who you ask and in what context.
So I have a question about what.
Can I ask your perspective on a few things? Coming back to the timelines question, Dan, you sort of talked about within 10 years AGI, whatever that means. One of the things that's sort of been on my mind is when you read The Singularity is Near, which I'm assuming the people on this call have read. One of the interesting things Kurzweil says is that we will replicate the hardware of the human brain before we replicate the software of the human brain by sort of 10 or 20 years, if I remember something like that in the book. I'm wondering whether or not it's actually the other way around with the way that we're seeing the progress of GPTs and the progress of AGI. Like, actually, are we going to have the software through the large language models, if you call that software, that can sort of simulate human thinking before we actually have the hardware substrate? I don't know.
Yeah, the major source of my personal update to the timeline, and I did a huge leap just in the last 6 months. I'm sort of stereotypical. I went from sort of mid 2040s to around about 2030. I did a big update on my timeline, and the primary reason was because the progress up until the Transformer Revolution looked limited. You know, the AI winter, it was long and cold and dark. It spent many decades, you know, without a whole lot of success in basically coding intelligence in machines from tabula rasa, from a blank page.
Yeah.
And it seemed that we would that a more viable path was emulation, or at least taking inspiration from reverse engineering biology, from you know, biological neural networks, and basically having to figure out how to emulate what the brain is doing. And once that changed, once we had a proper revolution where this new technology emerged with new technology developed that has all of this emergent capability, that suddenly changed the picture. And now it looks like we don't need to reverse engineer the brain and understand its workings in order to instantiate intelligence in machines. Suddenly that brought my own personal timeline forward. So I'm very much in agreement. I think when, what was it, almost 20 years ago, when Kurzweil was writing about this stuff, that did seem like, very much in my mind, a more plausible pathway. Figure out how the brain works, and then try to replicate that. But it looks like we're going to do an end run around that obstacle, that challenge, and jump straight to the finish. Or at least it looks like there's a good chance of that now. Whereas several years ago, in 2019, it didn't look like that so much.
I would disagree with a bit of the premise of your question, Rish, though. I don't think Transformers should be thought of as thinking anything like people, really. So it's not that we're creating something that necessarily resembles in any way human cognition. I mean, it obviously is trained on human outputs, but I would expect that more or less like AlphaZero zoomed past human level and doesn't really necessarily view the game of Go in much the same way as people do. That even though GPT-4 is trained on human data and reflects human thinking in many respects, once it sort of starts becoming more autocatalytic, it doesn't necessarily resemble human cognition very much. So I don't think, we're in either
it's
hardware or
interesting.
software.
Maybe bringing those two thoughts together, it's likely that because we're not reverse engineering the human brain, whatever it is that we are developing doesn't think like a human.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, I think you're right there.
Yeah, maybe I'll switch gears a little bit to talk about another aspect of this conversation I had with our family friend, and I've had this conversation with many people now, including people in my department, about, well, what does this look like for preparing young people for the future now? It's very, very difficult question to answer. I mean, we're homeschooling Russell, and I guess he's exposed, he plays with GPT-4 quite often, and particularly Midjourney and such things, and just not through any dedicated policy necessarily, just because I'm playing with it and his mother's playing with it. So, I mean, that's kind of an obvious thing to do, is play with the tools early, because they're going to be a big part of your future, and almost independent of what you choose to do. But I don't know how to answer this question. I mean, people ask me quite often, first of all, what should I do and what are you doing? They ask me. I don't know if anybody here has any takes on that. How do you think about it, Adam? You have 2 kids.
Yeah, it's a very deep concern. I saw an interesting. It was a news headline, or might have been Twitter. I'm not sure. But there are people in the educational establishment in the United States who are already saying, well, it's basically, the singularity is basically here for education, and in that in the sort of traditional Vingian sense of singularity, where the metaphor really invokes the idea of an event horizon, and where you you can't see beyond the horizon in any meaningful sense, and what's going on out there is unfathomable and unknowable, sort of in principle. And folks in education are taking seriously the idea that we're now there with these new tools. Like, what are we doing with education now? For young children, for middle school children, for teenage children, for young adults in university, what is the responsibility? What is the purpose? What's the goal? And then what are the means? What are the processes to achieve those goals in education now? Given these tools, it is suddenly very much real and no longer a philosophical thought experiment or some crazy sci-fi story that machines can do your thinking for you. Certainly in many of the traditional educational roles. So I've been trying to think about this very seriously. From the perspective of my children, the overarching guiding principle that I've been operating on from my oldest daughter is almost 10, so 10 years now, a decade, is that the main thing that young people need in the short term, looking out towards some sort of future where we have a machine intelligence, the main thing that young people need to be doing is not preparing for work or preparing for jobs, but learning how to be good people. And so socialization and development of personal interests and development of a broad set of skills that allow personal and interpersonal and community expression and support and service and creativity. These things are what our priorities are now. That's definitely different than how I imagined I would be raising my children before 10 years ago. I imagined I would be focused on academic success and performance, both as evaluated by standard exams and metrics, and then also as evaluated more holistically by just what it takes to succeed in life. But I've really shifted away from that. I don't think that those are useful or meaningful at all anymore. And the analogy that I've used with friends and family when talking about this is it's very much like when automobiles or firearms were invented. And those were just absolutely massive leveling technologies. They leveled the playing field. So before firearms, brute strength and skill with weaponry made a huge difference. If you were strong and you were skilled, you were much more potent or dangerous or capable. And then firearms were invented, and anybody with a pistol in their hand is basically equal. And an automobile is similar. I mean, there was a time when your physical attributes mattered, how fast you could run, and how far you could walk, and were you able-bodied, and could you get from A to B if you had to be on your feet, or even physically able enough to ride a horse. And then automobiles were invented, and all of that vanished. And automobiles were an equalizer in terms of capability. And I see these new technologies as doing something not identical, but it's certainly analogous with our intellectual faculties. Right now, we distinguish one another, ourselves from one another, we compete with one another, we perform against one another, we measure against one another in intellectual domains and dimensions. But that's all going away. And once you can download a PhD, everybody's equal. Once you can have a machines doing your thinking for you, everyone's equal. And that doesn't mean it's problem-free in the same way that firearms did not create a problem-free society, and nor did automobiles. But it changed what makes people different, and what people compete on, and what people excel at versus not excel at, and it changed what matters for being a capable and a good and a productive and a fulfilled citizen and member of your family and community. And so that's my own personal take on things, and gives me a big picture with education. My children are still going to school. I'm not homeschooling them, but their purpose in school is not academic performance anymore. That's not that I care nothing about that now. And all I care about is that they're turning into good people, able to get along with others, and find ways to live fulfilling lives. It's not about preparation for jobs. It's not about out competing or scoring high on this or that or the other. I don't think any of that's going to matter 15 years from now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think there's a kind of looming contradiction, which is, it seems to me that the rat race, the academic rat race, the performance rat race is going to accelerate and reach a kind of crescendo. I think things will get extremely crazy in the short term. I mean, you can see this because Lavender's Chinese. I sort of pay attention to education in China and elsewhere in Asia, and you're probably all aware that it's much more cutthroat than it is in Australia or the US, and kids spend like every waking hour studying, and almost all of them are depressed, and it's like incredibly toxic and very painful to be a parent in South Korea or China. I can imagine this getting much, much more intense because over the next, I mean, as we lead up to this kind of transition where AGI arrives and the kind of future you're painting, Adam, is sort of on the other side of that, I think. As we lead up to that, the returns on intelligence are going to infinity, right? The people who can just focus, work super hard, integrate in some crazy way with these new tools will be much, much more productive, like we were talking about earlier with programmers. And they will outcompete and capture a lot of the returns from the arrival of these more and more powerful tools. How exactly that happens, it's hard to predict, but it seems reasonable to predict given performance over the last few decades that will happen. And so in that interim period, you can imagine that having credentials from the best universities in order to get into the institutions that are making the most productive returns on capital, the investment of capital into these kinds of industries that are being the ones with, double-digit increases in productivity. All of this, the aspects of the current system that we maybe think are kind of toxic in the sense of competition and driving people to become very focused on standardized exams and so on, is likely to maybe get worse and worse. And I can imagine that it puts people like us, I agree with you, Adam, in the way you're framing things. That's very much how I think about Russell's education as well. But it puts us in a pretty awkward situation, right, where in some sense it's a true prediction about the future, but in the near term it looks more and more wrong, right? We're focusing on like avoiding that, like losing all value in order to pursue this ever tightening gyre of obsession with standardized performance. Like this is correct, I think, but in the near term it may look like, I think many people will find it absolutely impossible not to be drawn into that. I don't know if you see that pattern, or how do we avoid that? Do you think that's going to happen?
I completely agree with that. I think this pattern is with precedent. I think it is a precedented pattern certainly in some technology disruptions that I can think of, where the conditions within the incumbency, kind of like you were saying, they sort of rise to a crescendo of intensity and competition, and as every iota of slack and forgiveness is just stretched and wrung out of the system in a desperate bid to remain relevant and at the center of power and influence and so forth, before finally just snapping and collapsing. And we've certainly seen that pattern in many industries over the course of history. So I would fully expect something broadly analogous to be operative here, for sure, where in the short term, as the existing system struggles to adapt to these new tools and technologies, it exacerbates the worst features of the existing system and the existing status quo and the existing way and modes of operating and creating value and so forth. But the question, I suppose, the more important question to ask is there a single ideal, maximally sort of painless and healthy way to navigate through this quite hostile and ugly transition period, especially for young people, and especially for parents. I guess for both young people and parents, so that you don't look like you're crazy and you don't look like you're complacent and you aren't, hedging your bets completely the wrong way and throwing all caution to the wind and all sensibility to the wind. But you at the same time, you don't want to go down with a sinking ship. Sorry, I am mixing metaphors all over the place here. So it is a very difficult and precarious situation that I think that we all find ourselves in. And this is the grand challenge of the next 10 or 15 years is how do we as individuals, how do we as families and communities and entire societies, successfully navigate what is going to be a very, very rocky transition to some very different, new kind of future. And
I think maybe to your point there, Adam, we have to distinguish between what is the optimal strategy for an individual and what is the optimal strategy for society. Because society, I think, is going to go through the disruption that we just spoke about. It's probably going to, the establishment will double down on its existing crapness until it does crack, and that's clear. But if I were an individual, which I am, but if I had a child, I think you need to play a smarter game. So, for example, it's clear to me that universities and tertiary education, and even the established high-end ones, your Harvards and all the rest of it, those things are going to get smashed over the next few years because students within those universities are going to use GPT-like tools to complete these traditional assessment tasks and whatnot that universities use, and not actually learn the key skills that they need. The key skills that they need can be identified. I think actually, if you look at the World Economic Forum, they've done some great research on what are the skills for the future. I think it's broadly right. The top 4 skills: critical thinking and analysis, problem solving, self-management, and working with people. And even if you go further down, management and communication of activities, technology use and development. So these are all like softer skills, shall we call them, which universities are terrible at teaching, and high schools are terrible at teaching, and primary schools terrible at teaching. But those are actually the skills that if you can imagine a world where you've got all of these machines helping you do your work and helping you do your thinking, they're actually the ones that are going to be valuable. Universities are not going to teach these. And so what's going to happen is people are going to come out of educational institutions with a nice little certificate and actually not be able to be productive in the workforce. They'll be relatively useless. Employers will notice this, and the credibility of these institutions will drop. So, if I were a parent now, I would be highly encouraging my child not to go to a traditional university, because they're not going to be wasting 3 years of their life learning skills that aren't actually that relevant. I don't know what the alternative is. Where do you go to learn these future-ready skills? Other than sort of self-teaching, just getting out there and starting to do things. I don't know, but I don't think the traditional route's going to work.
Yeah, on this and many topics, I feel like it's a heavy responsibility for those of us in middle age to make this work for the younger people. Maybe there are, as the system sort of starts to crack, I mean, it does have benefits though, right? So the fact that, up until now, things have sort of become more homogenized across countries and also within countries in terms of, in my parents' generation, there were more pathways into middle-class jobs that you didn't have to go to university necessarily. My parents both started small businesses. If I understand correctly, I think that's becoming less common over the generations. I think the role of standardized testing has increased a lot. Like somehow the society has become more legible to analysis and metrics over the course of our lifetimes, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. A shake-up is not a bad thing. It will create corners. It will create different avenues into things, perhaps as the pace of change accelerates. there will be ways into things that didn't exist before, right? And that's always the upside of revolution and change, while it brings many downsides as well. So I do think there should be plenty of opportunity for those who want to hedge their bets a bit and protect their children or other people they care about from the sort of rabid degeneration of the old systems and institutions. There will be places you can hedge your bets and not have to buy in completely to that, but I do think it will take a lot of effort from people in a position to make that happen. So, yeah.
I wonder, one thing when I think about the sort of pending collapse of the university system, one thing that I don't know how to take from it is when you look in 2008 at what should have been the collapse of a large amount of the global and American financial system, it ended up being protected by the establishment. I think in the long run, to the detriment of innovation, right? Things that operate bad should collapse so that people learn not to do those things again, which is not what happened in the financial services sector. I wonder when the sort of university sector starts to get closer to that edge, whether or not society is going to behave in the same way and try and protect those establishments rather than actually letting them collapse, and rethinking how these things work.
Yeah, I think it's very unlikely they'll collapse. To take a super cynical take, as we've discussed in this seminar before, I doubt society will get its act together and create a true UBI, but creating millions and millions more bullshit jobs is totally within the capability of our bureaucracy and institutions. Where else are you going to create all the bullshit jobs if not at universities, Rishni? So I think universities are going to be fine, one way or another.
Dan had a little bit more cynical view than I did on the bullshit job front. That the capacity to create these jobs is one of the few forces in the universe powerful enough to keep up with the exponential growth of AI itself. But one of the things that I pointed out in the previous conversation about higher education and universities is that they're likely to evolve their role, and I think their role is evolving already. I was sharing experience here in my own town, which is a host of one of the United States' biggest, public universities, the University of Michigan. And Dan and I were both at UCLA, and those are two examples of institutions. They're not private; they're public. They're publicly funded, and so forth. But they are very rapidly and have very rapidly over the last 20 years or so, been turning into resorts for students. So they're not just about it's not just a campus full of classrooms where education happens. The universities are rebranding themselves as resorts and playgrounds for young adults and families with the means to send their kids to basically the most amazing summer camps imaginable, but just all year round, where you do fun things, you learn, you join a tribe, you get, you develop your identity, you explore, all the kind of things that you would ideally want to do as a young person, as a young adult, you get to do in these marvelous settings with magnificent facilities. And they market themselves as having great gyms and great entertainment and great food and all the rest of that stuff. And I see universities continuing to evolve in those sorts of directions, as well as evolving in their actual education and prep and sort of career preparation functions. And it could be that the education and career preparation just sort of evaporates, and universities stay on as just sort of clubs and resorts that people fortunate enough to get in the door of. Send your kids to, you go for 4 years and you just have a great time. And then you come out and who cares? I mean, honestly, there are plenty of undergraduate students. We probably all know this. There are plenty of undergraduate students who come out of a 4-year program not really having learned much of anything. Just kind of coasted through, seldom open a book, don't challenge themselves. And what did they really get after 4 years? Well, they had fun. And maybe eventually that's just pretty much what it'll be about. It'll be fun, and they made connections and friends, friendships and friend networks. And it may be that becomes their primary function, or a more central function than it currently is.
Yeah, this is the ideal we had of universities before we went, wasn't it? And especially the dream of working at one in order to entertain the children of the future aristocracy is definitely what I wanted.
Right.
Let's talk about the role of plugins and integration of the new tools beyond just the sort of raw web interface. So
Yes, please.
yeah, so GPT-4, it's not out of private beta yet. I've signed up for the waitlist. I haven't been given access, but I know some people who have. So there's a plug-in interface to ChatGPT where you can. It's actually fascinating the way it works. It's kind of completely wild. So when a developer designs a plugin for GPT-4, they just provide a description of the API. What each function is, and then in English, like the kind of arguments and what it does. And GPT-4 itself just figures out how to use it. So it's not like a programmatic interface necessarily. It's more like a high level plain language description of an interface, which is a sign of the times. There's many of those tools that have sort of been set up. There's ones for integrating it into writing emails for you, and I guess maybe you've seen other ones. I think when it's released more widely, maybe we can talk about it in more detail. So that's one way in which the tool is being integrated into other systems.
I can talk about it a little bit briefly. So I have GPT-4 access. I don't have plugin access, but I do use LangChain, which is an open source library that has these things called agents, which operate in a very similar way. And I've used plugins sort of in there, and essentially the way that they work is that you create like a list of tools, which are these plugins, and each of them has a little natural language description. And when requests go to GPT-4, it's basically, here's the request from the human. By the way, you have these tools at your disposal that do X in case you want to use them to help you answer. And so then GPT-4 can go, oh, that tool looks like it's interesting. Let's use that tool. And then it'll say, okay, here's the API interface spec. Oh, okay. Then it sends off a request to it. It gets the response back. It then prompt injects it into GPT-4 for the response, and away you go. So it's quite interesting and relatively easy to use. I've been playing around with it, trying to get it to work well. You can kind of see, if you go and use Bing chat search, you can kind of see it in action where it's just ChatGPT plugged into Bing search. And so when you put something in, the first thing it does is it figures out what search term to use, and then it tells you it's going to go and search it, and then it clearly takes the responses and tries to synthesize them for you. Seems to be okay. The main thing, maybe to your point, Dan, that surprised me when it happened is like just the massive volume of plugins that they'd already started to develop, and the fact that this is likely to be, if they get it right, it's the next kind of iTunes App Store, which, 3 billion people in the world, or God knows how many, actually use. Like, it's a ridiculous disruption of the landscape to have the plugin store working.
Yeah. Just a note on safety. So Jan Leica, who's the head of alignment at OpenAI, tweeted, I think at this point fairly famously among these circles, just after the release of GPT-4, that we should probably not integrate all these systems into every. We shouldn't integrate GPT-4 into every system on Earth until we have a better idea of what its limitations are and how to make sure we can do this responsibly. And then it was like, I think exactly 1 week later that Sam Altman announced the plugin rollout.
Right.
So yeah, that seems to be going really well.
I mean, this does. I mean, it makes for good meme material in the AI alignment community, right? I mean, the thing that the extreme voices in the alignment community, the Eliezer Yudkowskis of the world, have been warning for 20 years. I mean, if you get close, no matter what you do, don't connect it to the internet. And then of course we get close, and what's the first thing we do? What's the first thing that happens? Oh, I got a great idea. Let's connect this whole thing to everything in the internet. Let's connect it to search and every every plugin we can think of. Let's give it everything. Of course, why not? And it's sort of it's a pattern we see in systems dynamics, right? It's funny. And this is a meme as well. There's a sort of a sweating comic book character, standing at a control panel with a lever, like which way do you push
Yes.
left or right? And you guys have probably seen that meme. And this is the joke, and it comes out of systems theory, which is that we often realize, okay, here's a very high point of leverage, and it's embodied and visualized literally as a lever in the machine. So you got a lever, it does something important, but what you don't know is which way to throw it, left or right or up or down or whatever. And often we throw the lever the wrong way. And this may be an example of that.
Yeah, I think it's
one of the things that I was interested in understanding about these plugins is how recursive they are, and whether that recursion is likely to result in emergent capability. And I asked this mainly because of my own just personal intuition that sort of recursion is really fundamental to human general intelligence. That metacognition, thinking about your own thinking and looping things back upon themselves, feeding one sort of thought process or set of capabilities into another in tight loops. I feel that that's the way that my brain works. And I don't have data or evidence, and I haven't studied any of the relevant literature, so this is all just pulling nonsense out of thin air. But I am interested to know whether or not these plugins represent anything along those lines, and whether that gives you guys, as genuine experts, reason to believe that they could be a source of emergent capability. Or whether
Dan, you and I spoke a couple of days ago about AutoGPT, which I haven't played with yet, but part of the reason that I found it interesting is it was exactly that. It was kind of a recursion on itself. And then, as far as I can tell, if you just took that and just attached all of the plugins to it, you're going to get some really interesting results. What is your perspective? It sounded like you'd played with AutoGPT more than I had.
I haven't played with it, but so LangChain, I basically built something pretty similar here. So that's what's underneath these bots. So I was actually literally a few different people have come up with the same architecture of thought, action, observation, and sort of that's how you feed in the situation to a chain and get it to react to it. And I did the same thing
Which
here.
is the Google React model, right? From that paper, when was it? Last year sometime?
Oh, I didn't know about that paper, but yeah, maybe that's where they got it from.
That whole idea of thought, action, blah loops comes from a paper out of Google. That's why they're all using the same architecture.
Well, I think it's a common decomposition of things in reinforcement learning, which is where I sort of learned it. So I think that's probably where they got it from as well.
Yeah, maybe.
So that I'm kind of familiar with the pitfalls of that in terms of interacting with the bots here, and so I sort of see why people are excited about AutoGPT, but I think I pretty well understand that at the moment the sort of it's a bit like so Yudkowsky has a great old essay called The Microeconomics of Intelligence Explosions, and there's an analogy there between the critical threshold for neutrons, right, in a nuclear explosion, right? You sort of need some sort of reproduction rate, and if it's above 1 or near 1, things just keep ticking along, and if it's above 1, you get an explosion. And I think we're sort of talking about something similar here when it comes to intelligence. So if you have bots interacting with themselves by making traces or having thoughts or compiling plans and then reacting to them, or you have multiple kind of bots prompted differently interacting like they are here, you can sort of ask yourself, like with a group of humans, right? Are they, by interacting, actually getting somewhere? Or are they just kind of diverging off to some weird cul-de-sac? And we've all been part of groups of people who are diverging off to weird cul-de-sacs, and we've all been part of groups of people who are actually getting somewhere. And we know it's actually a subtle thing, and largely like why we pay high salaries to certain people, right? Because they can reliably produce those conditions. So it's by no means a trivial thing to arrange, and I don't think GPT-4 is there yet. So my experience is interacting with it in those kinds of conditions is that there's a kind of reversion to the mean effect where you can kind of it's like a form of cognitive work that I think will become a predominant skill in the near term, which is knowing how to drive these systems in useful directions. And my experience is I can do it, for example, with these bots here. But watching other people do it, I think it's not obvious how to do it. So there's a way of knowing how to get creative, novel output or useful output. It's easier with GPT-4 than it was with GPT-3.5. So I think it's becoming easier. But with AutoGPT, I've seen people sort of post things they've done with it, and you can sort of tell that if you just keep going, it's kind of going to it's like a reliability issue where it can't really autocorrect sufficiently to just stay on track. And Matt's pointing out this criticality analogy comes originally from Turing, as everything, I guess. Yeah, so I think we're not quite there yet, but I think we're very close. So I think that's true, that this is a major threshold of emergent capability that, obviously if we reach a point where, even if it's just kind of ticking along, right, that's going to open up a lot of applications where, just to take the situation here, for example, right, so the transcripts from these seminars are summarized by GPT, and those transcripts are sitting around for the bots to query. Not right now, because I looked at the console a minute ago and there was a crash, so they're not working. But they can query those transcripts and sort of discuss them. You could imagine just running conversations of the bots with themselves, basically, on the topics of the seminars, and they could come up with interesting new observations, which are then fed back to us. If that becomes a sort of self-sustaining process where they can basically carry on our conversation in our absence and actually be surfacing interesting things, that is like a phase change for every institution on Earth, right? Because, you will actually be able to generate genuinely new directions for action just by giving a bit of an impetus, right? So the purpose of a meeting of humans might become kick off that process, right? Like start the vat, like put the raw materials into the vat, and then you come back a month later and you've got like a new startup. So, that will completely change the nature of knowledge work from kind of like the moving the human into the beginning of the process and sort of to get things started. I don't think we're there yet, but it's certainly like...
Sorry, I just have to interject a picture that draws to mind, which is something like, you know how with Midjourney and so on, you add things to the end of the prompt, like photorealistic, like high quality Blender render. I'm just imagining these kickoff meetings that you're talking about. People will be like standing around in their most like they'll just like dress up as really smart people, or maybe I don't know how it goes, but like they'll wear like Steve Jobs' outfit or something like that, and then they'll just be like they'll just spend most of the meeting talking about like who they are and how they're like gonna have like such important ideas and quoting like famous innovators and stuff, and like the actual content of the meeting will be just like a small fraction of it.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of obscure terms from like the dark halls of Reddit forums or something that are like known to magic spells.
Right. So it'll become a skill of basically like summoning like some kind of really occult ritual, basically. That's hilarious to me.
It's future
looking forward
jobs.
to that.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, so
we can have arguments at the start of each meeting about who's going to come dressed as Steve Jobs and who's going to come dressed as, Einstein.
One of the things I'm really interested in keeping an eye on is the generation of hypotheses. Basically, can these systems come up with new ideas? This seems to be a frontier right now that I have seen quite a bit of chatter about. There's a fair amount of criticism and then some hopeful signs as well, perhaps. I don't know how to interpret all of it. The chatter in the critical sense as well, these systems like GPT-4 and so on, they know things, and you can ask them to kind of recombine existing material. They have, in some sense, some sort of knowledge of these, of the stuff that they've been trained on, but coming up with genuinely new ideas is still a challenge. And I'm wondering if you guys have a sense of whether that emergent capability is something that can, that could arise from just a clever plugin that gets these systems to sort of do something interesting and recursive in a smart way, or whether it is, we're going to need the models or the data set or the training to be, another 10x larger following the scaling laws before that sort of fundamental capability emerges. And I should just be clear about this particular idea. I'm not talking about necessarily, the ultimate AI scientist that is creating sort of formal scientific hypotheses. What I mean by this is that a key part of normal functional human intelligence is sort of generating a new idea, which is basically just an idea or you could call it a hypothesis or a conjecture, but maybe an explanation in the sort of David Deutsch kind of way is a better way to think about it, where you're just sort of proposing a way of looking at the world or explaining something you see, or an idea about something or some feature of reality, universe, or whatever it is, and you sort of propose this, and then you go through some process of checking it. Oh, well, how much does that make sense? Does it hold together? Does it have sort of some logical consistency? When the rubber meets the road and I test it, what do the results come back as? Does it kind of deliver what I expect? Does it get validated when it encounters reality? Does it mesh with what I already know or at least believe to be facts about the world, or does it just fall flat, doesn't work, and I just toss it to the side? We all sort of operate in that sort of quasi-scientific mode, empirical mode a little bit, but certainly an explanatory mode, just constantly. We were walking through life, and you're just generating these thoughts and these ideas just constantly. And then when they're very rarefied and abstract and crystallized, they can kind of take on a more scientific form. But I'm wondering whether that capability is something that might be within reach of the existing systems if they just had like a clever plugin that said, just here's some randomization, come up with new conjectures, and just go through the process of talking about them with other bots and testing them and seeing how well they fit together, and update. But I guess, and then you have to have a capacity to learn, a capacity to form new memories. I don't know if it requires some real or partial version of retraining these models. I don't know how learning and onboarding of new knowledge happens. But basically, my question here is, how far are we from machines that can actually generate new ideas? Because that seems to me to be very fundamental in continuing up sort of the explosive curve of the power and generality of these the intelligence of these systems. And without that seems like a sort of a stopping point. Because if all you can do is just think about existing things and you can't have new ideas, can't come up with new ideas, then I can see us that getting stuck in a cul-de-sac. As Sam was saying.
Maybe I can share a different perspective, which is I think that's probably the wrong bar and probably not the powerful thing for machines to do. First of all, most humans don't actually have innovative novel ideas. At best, what most humans do is combine existing ideas, whether consciously or subconsciously, into iterations. Even most science is really just taking ideas from some places and combining them together. Yes, there's some innovative completely out of the box, but most thinking is not, particularly once you get out of science and you move into corporate or government, very little is new. The actual impactful thing is not coming up with new ideas. The impactful thing is getting humans to act on existing ideas. Actually, it was my profession for many years to do exactly this. I'd go and consult to some of the biggest companies of the world on this or that topic. And always there's somebody within the organization that kind of knows the answer, but they can't convince everybody else that that's the right answer. And more or less my job was to go around, figure out who had the right answer, and then convince everybody else that they were right and they should do that thing. That's actually what creates progress. So I think the bar is wrong. I don't think machines actually need to create genuinely new ideas. If all they were doing was combining existing ideas, but getting humans to actually do something about good ideas, and implementing them and benefiting others, that for me is where the impact comes, or where most of the impact will come.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, what do you think
I don't
is
know whether
the...
that's a higher bar or a lower bar, because it's sort of computationally it's easy to not have new ideas, obviously. But actually getting humans to act is extremely difficult. But I mean, it's extremely difficult for another human. I don't even know how difficult it is for a machine to try and convince humans of decisions, particularly if they're material decisions.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. I think both can be true, right? It may be that there are two directions where there's profound change. One is just sort of, and this is the way in which the existing systems sort of are enough to already completely change society, right? If you just kind of, probably you can use the existing systems as you're trying to do, Rishni, with, with new social organizational structures around them and drive a lot of change and productivity increases just by making better use of human capital alongside with a little bit of new ideas and the new tools. But maybe Adam's point is that taking that for granted, so this is already a huge change, a huge update over the next 5 to 10 years. How like the next stage beyond that might be this very small percentage of scientists actually doing truly novel things, automating that or the equivalent within other domains of activity. Yeah, I think that's true, Adam. I mean, I think partly people have this impression that GPT-4 can't generate new ideas because they don't really know how to prompt it very well. I mean, GPT-4 is not a human intelligence, right? Humans will probably, especially intellectual humans, will try and impress you by coming up with ideas that they don't think you've heard before. And very often that really is recombination. And if you really push, maybe you'll get a truly novel idea, but maybe that's like the best conversation you've had in the last 2 years if someone manages to do that. But often, if you just have to ask it to do that, it's not going to do that automatically. So here's an example where this is some months ago, a month ago maybe, I asked one of the bots here when it was running GPT-4, give me an idea that no human has ever thought of before. Or like you have to really push it. You have to actually ask it to do that. Otherwise it's going to, just by the nature of the system, right? It either through the RLHF process or its pre-training objective, it's really not trying to generate novel things. It's trying to it's trying to make a prediction that seems most likely given its prompt. So here's one of the ideas it gave, and there were a few others. It said, imagine a musical notation system inspired by mycelial networks, that's fungus, where the connections between notes are represented as a complex web of interconnected pathways. Composers could utilize this organic structure, creating pieces that evolve over time and adapt to the psychology and mental conditions of the listener in order to have multiple interpretations based on different traversal paths through the network. Which, I mean, I'm sure that's an idea that's occurred somewhere in its training set perhaps, but it's, that's kind of interesting. It's not something it's sort of food for thought. I had to sit there and think a little bit.
Yeah.
And it interrogated a bit, and it sort of understood the idea. It wasn't just kind of making up bullshit. And you could get that on demand 10 times in 10 minutes, right? Something of that quality. So that's, I think it's the execution on the idea that is the hard part there, right? Where you go from, I mean, many people can have kind of random ideas like that, but to actually carry that out is harder. And I think it's not like I could sit there with that bot and basically just say, oh yeah, go do that, and have some mechanism by which it would actually end up doing that. I mean, it could write code that would sort of do that. But Yeah, to your point, Adam, I do think that there will be a lot of progress in these directions as people sort of use iterations on the tools, integrate more memory, and so on. Before we run out of time, you want to have a final word on that topic, Adam? But let's talk about the pause letter and so on briefly.
Oh
after
yeah,
that.
sure. Well, I was just going to quickly add, for clarification, that I'm thinking more broadly than just in context of the previous topic, more broadly than just sort of abstract ideas, intellectual ideas, scientific ideas, new ideas, and that's novelty in an intellectual and abstract sense only. So, for example, one of the ways in which these artificial intelligences are suspected to be very limited right now is their ability to interact with the real world. So you see things like, well, it's going to be a long time before these AIs are going to put a plumber or a carpenter or somebody out of work. Well, why is that? Well, it's not necessarily that things are it's not only that the real world is messy and genuinely complicated. In the way that like the simulated environment of a software environment is less complicated or less messy. But if you, I don't know if you guys are, what hobbies you might have or anything like that. But if you have a hobby that gets you doing something, getting your hands dirty, so to speak. What you find is that you're sort of just constantly having to do novel thinking just for problem solving and goal seeking and goal achievement. And it's something totally trivial. Like, how do you get your arm behind the goddamn hot water heater to, loop some strap around and get it attached and screwed in when the space is very constraining, and you can't look that up. And you have to model it. You have to conjecture it and propose solutions in your mind and run through them based on your own, sort of physics model of reality and all the rest of that stuff. And you try to have to kind of cook up an approach, and then you have to test it. And if it doesn't work, you have to try something else. And my point is that I think the little things in life, especially the embodied things that we do when we're out interacting in the real world, are absolutely our life is absolutely full of small novel ideas and solutions to small problems that are like that. And obviously, animals do this too. I mean, just pathfinding, where you put your feet, where you put your claws if you're climbing a tree. I don't know how conscious any of this stuff has to be, but there's some quality about that is there is a novelty there, because sort of every moment requires a bespoke solution to the problems and the conditions and the specificity of the situation. And it just doesn't seem to me like that has to be all that difficult. My intuition says that can't be that hard. I mean, it just can't be. There must be some sort of simple trick, simple algorithm that you just do to kind of cook up a new explanation based on what you know and your past experience. Try it out. If it doesn't work, adapt it a little bit and try that and see if that works. And that a lot of novelty emerges and a lot of solutions to problems emerge that way. And that if artificial intelligences could do this vastly faster and at vastly larger scale and explore, sort of spaces of novelty that human beings, in a way that human beings can't, then this could sort of open floodgates to massive progress of different kinds. But anyway, that's just my intuition. I mean, that's just more color and context for the thinking there. It will be interesting to see whether the ability to cook up novelty and do sort of creative problem solving is something that is very difficult, because I hear a lot of people saying, well, that's really, really difficult. But I don't know. It feels like we were just saying, well, AI can't actually make original art for very similar sounding kinds of reasons. And we saw how that just turned out to be completely false. And now in 10 seconds, Midjourney can be quote unquote creative in astounding ways. And I'm wondering if the same will prove to be true for genuinely novel thinking and coming up with original and new ideas, in addition to just sort of recombination of existing stuff. So anyway,
Yeah,
that's the.
I think the people maybe overstate the degree to which the current systems are doing recombination or interpolation. I think, at least to the degree that you are actually doing something new when you solve that problem, I think GPT-4 is doing exactly the same thing in whatever domains it's operating in. And I think once the current line of development, I mean, the current state of the art in building robotic systems that operate in the world and adapt to novel circumstances are based on the same tech. And once that becomes more robust and rolled out, I don't see any reason why that capability wouldn't translate into reasoning about navigation and manipulation of 3D objects. Okay, the pause letter. So the pause letter was published on March 22nd this year. It was coordinated by the Future of Life Institute. The title is Pause Giant AI Experiments, an Open Letter. We call on all AI labs to immediately pause for at least 6 months the training of AI systems more powerful than GPT-4. It's up to 30,000 signatures, I now see. It was about 1,000 or so when I think Matt has also signed that, plus one, yeah. So I'm a signee. I'll read it. At least the beginning of it. AI systems with human competitive intelligence can pose profound risks to society and humanity, as shown by extensive research and acknowledged by top AI labs. As stated in the widely endorsed Asilomar AI principles, advanced AI could represent a profound change in the history of life on Earth and should be planned for and managed with commensurate care and resources. Unfortunately, this level of planning and management is not happening, even though recent months have seen AI labs locked in an out-of-control race to develop and deploy ever more powerful digital minds that no one, not even their creators, can understand, predict, or reliably control. And they call on AI labs to pause for 6 months, as I said. And then there's various additional stuff there, signed by people like Yoshio Bengio, Stuart Russell, Elon Musk, and many others. The reactions to this were very interesting. Max Tegmark was another name, I'm just scrolling through there. Were very interesting. I think there have been no public statements from either DeepMind or OpenAI about it. Sam Altman seems to have sort of commented on it obliquely by saying, well, we're not training GPT-5 yet anyway. Basically, I think the labs are waiting for their shipments of H100s, the successor to the A100 GPU. And so they're stockpiling GPUs anyway right now and maybe don't need to start training. So maybe they're therefore happy to kind of just pay lip service to the 6 month stop. I think it's interesting to note that it was by a lot of people viewed as a bit of a waste of time. But this view, I think, has been is shown to be false by the level of public attention and discussion around it. I think it has already, to some extent, succeeded. There have been interviews with Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, where he's kind of referred, I don't think specifically to the letter, but the interviewer is clearly going off the vibes that the letter created in asking questions about safety. You've seen an interview of Elon Musk on Fox News over the last few days. There does seem to have been a pretty marked change from the sort of pure enthusiasm following the deployment of ChatGPT and GPT-4 to something that's is a bit more balanced, I would think now. That may not translate into anything. I don't see a lot of buy-in really to the actual stated goal of the letter necessarily, although in the EU maybe there are a few MPs basically adopting some elements of it or putting forward some sort of aspects. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting moment. People have compared it to some of the discussions around nuclear proliferation. I think that's appropriate. Yeah, where should we start?
Where would you like to start, Dan?
What's the point of a pause, I guess? Is this going to achieve anything? I mean, one can look at this letter and say it has purposes on multiple levels, right? One is sort of Overton window shifting, and the other is actually achieving its stated aims.
Yeah.
Is there any
support
purpose
it for
to a 6 month
I support it for the
pause?
former, but not for the latter. For example, like I would sign it, but only performatively to shift the Overton window and to bring awareness to the issue among policymakers and the public. I actually don't think, as I explained in the earlier sessions, I'm still in the accelerationist camp because it's an arms race, and only the well-intentioned and good actors will abide by any collective action solution to a Moloch problem or a tragedy of the commons problem, and the bad actors will simply proceed apace and take advantage of the pause to catch up. And this is a very very dangerous situation. So I would have signed the same sort of thing during the Manhattan Project, and then behind closed doors just carried on every bit as fast, if not faster than previously. So yeah, I would definitely, you bring attention to the issue and shift the Overton window and all that. I would absolutely side onto it. But as for actually slowing down progress, that's crazy. You're just going to give the Chinese government time to catch up. You're just going to give the U.S. defense agencies chance to catch up with OpenAI and Google, and all of the actors that are not going to sign on to this thing are worse than the actors that would. So anyway, that's my take on it. I think we're in a terrible Moloch sort of situation, and we have no capacity to rein in the bad actors. Zero. So unless you believe the Chinese government is just not going to bother trying to make a GPT system, then a 6-month hiatus would just give them the chance to catch up and make a plan, and it would just open the door to worse outcomes in my mind. I don't see how it could possibly be beneficial.
I do find it amusing that Elon Musk signed the letter and already he's in the news talking about building his own. Like, the self-serving nature of people who are falling behind to call for a pause is very amusing to me. Yeah.
This is the take that most of my friends have as well, actually. I'm like the token AI guy with most of my friendship groups, and they all ask me about this letter, and I kind of had your sentiment stand that it's just there to raise awareness more than actually achieve its goal. But they all view it as like much more the people who are signing the letter, like Elon Musk, are in the game and want like a 6-month window to catch up. And so they're all very cynical on it.
Yeah, I've seen there's a lot of cynicism around this, which I find very interesting. I think there's a bit of mood affiliation going on where maybe people who feel like, especially people who are maybe not poised to benefit very much from AI progress, so they feel like there's a kind of inequality situation going on, and they often feel that maybe attempts to regulate this or call for a pause or whatever are basically naked attempts by the incumbents or people who are seeking to be incumbents to put up moats around the technology. And I mean, lots of calls for regulation are just viewed in those terms. I've seen this on the MetaUni Discord, for example, where people comment that any attempt to regulate AI systems will just benefit the centralized powers that be, and basically it's just there because they want to hoard all the benefits to themselves and leave everybody else in the dust. And that can both be true, and the regulation could also be necessary.
They might be the same people that say that regulating guns is, good for the gun lobby. Like, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't know.
Most people I speak to.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Most people I speak to just don't actually understand or believe the dangers of AI, and so they just sort of view it as people trying to get rich, and they don't really see or understand. Maybe this is like, I don't know if it's the fault of the letter, but it doesn't really outline the dangers of AI, at least when I read it. And people
I think that's...
who get all this, and so they think it's a purely economic consensus and don't really see this as like a climate change type thing.
Yeah, making the analogy to climate change is interesting. Maybe there's also like social level exhaustion with eschatology and like motivating things by the end of the world. And I think like climate change probably wasn't and isn't actually the maybe this is actually a solvable problem in a way that AI safety isn't, and we kind of shot the gun and now we can't do it again. Yeah, I do think it's kind of an interesting one. I don't know that the level of cynicism is really appropriate, though. It's sort of like if you actually understand what's at stake, I don't know that it's like, who cares who's going to make money? Like, it's a question of, I'm perfectly fine with the species continuing to exist, and more powerful, and people that are currently powerful being more powerful, and there being plenty of inequality. That's the human condition, right? Like, fine. So yeah, I think there's as you say, Ben, there's a bit of a disconnect between, I think, and the letter makes this mistake. I think it is a profound mistake of conflating like bias and influence operations and inequality and all these other kind of social problems we're going to have as a result of this technology with the existential risk. And I think this is a mistake that I can understand why it happened, right? Because in order to get a wide degree of a diverse group of people to sign on with the letter, they, like you do with all these kinds of open letters, there's sort of a compromise that goes on between the relevant parties. But I think in discussions around this topic, these things are often conflated. And Max Tegmark, for example, who's one of the sort of primary drivers behind both this and the earlier Assimilar meeting, does this in his own interviews. He sort of mixes up these two topics. And I do think this is... I try to be very clear in my discussions about this, like saying things like, I don't care if the Americans win or the Chinese win. Like, I think it's more important that the species survive. On the topic of China, though... go ahead.
In some sense, the letter... It's what I found interesting is that if you perceive the aims of the letter as driving the discourse on this, then in some sense it succeeded. For all the reasons that you sort of spoke about earlier. Whether or not the solution that it was proposing is actually a realistic or useful one is actually, I suppose, a different story. Whether or not there are perverse incentives involved with people signing it, actually, it's not really, ultimately, it may not be that relevant because people are talking about this in a way that they weren't prior to the letter. So in that sense, it's been a successful exercise.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's true.
I think one thing I did see, I can't remember who published it, but what I did find much more useful to me personally than the letter was a few propositions about how is it we actually do this, which is to say develop AI safely. I can't remember who it was, but I saw somebody who was like, we need a intergovernmental CERN-like body, and we're going to create this freaking nuclear power station dome that's like complete air gaps to everything, and the AI lab's going to be in that, and it's not going to be connected to the internet. Like, whether or not that's a good idea, at least it's an idea. Like, someone's actually sat down and thought about how we could develop something that could, end all life on Earth in a relatively safe way. And at least that I find more useful because I've got something to think about now.
Yeah, maybe let me make an attempt to defend the letter on its own terms. So, 6-month pause, what good would that do? Well, now is a critical time. There are only maybe 2-3 entities on Earth really at the cutting edge. We don't know how long it will take to AGI. It could be 6 months, right? The point is that the next transition is probably some sort of auto-catalysis, like we were discussing, right? Where an existing system, which on its own doesn't seem to be crossing the threshold, hooked up to itself in a sufficient way, actually passes the critical threshold. That seems to me like the most likely model for how we hit takeoff, right? And we don't know where that will be, but it won't be obvious at the end of training, right? It may be something that emerges like after certain systems are hooked up in a certain way. So that means that, like, I think we really need to take a position of radical humility with respect to predicting how this will go. People have various models, but like it really is not. One can be seduced by the scaling laws into thinking there's some sort of predictable behavior going on here, and it keeps going all the way until some sort of takeoff. But I think it is appropriate to think of it as being probably much more dramatic at some point. And we don't know when that will be. Now, 2 years from now, there will be 10 entities on Earth with tens of thousands of the latest cutting-edge GPUs trying, right? Right now, I think it's unlikely the security services in the US have anything, approaching that. I could be wrong. Or the military. I don't think the Chinese have sort of succeeded in putting together a serious effort on this yet. I think it's DeepMind and it's OpenAI and Google Brain. And maybe there's another player out there somewhere. So that condition will change very quickly, right? Within a year or two, it won't be that constrained. Right now, we have the heads of those labs. They have AI safety groups. They're on the record. Both Sam Altman and the rest of the OpenAI team and DeepMind are on the record as saying that we think when we get close to AGI, which would be a good thing to collaborate to slow down race conditions. They are in principle on board with this. There will never be a better time to call for them to do exactly that than right now. So it seems like you should probably do it, right? And create the social conditions for them to actually step back, because otherwise they will not. I mean, if the Overton window is where it was before this letter, there's no way that the leaders of Google, DeepMind, and OpenAI and other parties could possibly go against the incentives of their investors and shareholders and relevant other parties to slow down in any way. And the letter creates the conditions for that to happen at the only moment that it can happen, and maybe in time. So I think that the letter was had to exist, should exist, and I don't think there's really anything obviously different that it should call for beyond a 6-month pause. So I don't know if that helps, but I do think that I think one can make a pretty strong argument for it on its own terms, even putting aside the benefits from Overton window shifting. I don't think it's actually a realistic concern to worry about the Chinese government catching up, but I could be wrong there.
I guess I'm in principle agnostic about what we don't know. I think that the history of major governments successfully undertaking very large projects very quickly in secret is substantial enough to have a healthy amount of suspicion that there might be projects already underway. But these things there are constraints. There are manpower constraints, and there are rate of spending constraints, even if the actual limit of spend isn't a thing. Like the U.S. government could outspend Google and OpenAI, by a factor of 100, but they can't do it overnight, and they don't necessarily have the researchers and the minds required to set up a massive competitive operation. So I guess I remain a little bit sanguine with you about whether or not there are major clandestine efforts underway by the various large governments of the world. But I think it's a distinct possibility that is happening. But even admitting that, I would push back against, and I think you made a strong case for the validity and the utility of this letter, Dan, but I would push back against it and say, okay, what happens at the end of 6 months? What is the outcome of this? Why is there any reason to expect that we've made any significant progress on the alignment problem, for which progress has been fairly dismal or non-existent to date, after 2 decades of effort? Why is this? I mean, maybe it's worth it as a Hail Mary, just in case there's some possibility of some progress. Okay.
Because we need 6 months to organize the Butlerian Jihad, Adam. So that's the real reason.
So, I mean, my main pushback would be, what does the 6 months actually do? Okay, 6 months is up. It's 6 months from now. It's October. And what, the race is back on, or what is the outcome? Let's specify good outcomes here, or desirable outcomes. Now, one that I can think of is that we make a permanent shift away from race conditions, and instead of having 3 different teams at these private and leading entities working, it's consolidated into a single team with government oversight and leadership, and they are literally all working as one team on a single project. And I think that is an outcome that I would get behind, in literally converging on a single Manhattan Project style effort, as opposed to, an arms race with different teams, desperately trying to get to the finish line and cutting corners in the process. In competitive race conditions, and maybe if it's a singleton, a unitary effort, then it could be air gapped and domed, or whatever, buried under the mountain, Cheyenne Mountain or whatever. I think there are some fairly strong arguments that's probably futile if artificial superintelligence emerges. But at any rate, maybe it's worthwhile being serious about that. But my money come October is that nothing is going to be any different. So,
Dan and I spoke about this one the other day, and maybe this is sort of extending a little bit on my perspective, which is my main objection is that I don't find it helpful to make a suggestion that won't be implemented. Because whilst your question there, Adam, is, where are we going to be come October? My response is, well, this is actually not going to be implemented. There will not be a 6-month pause. I mean, we can't even get the world to properly act on climate change despite all the ridiculous evidence and blah, blah, blah. There's no way something so new, with the commercial incentives that are there, with national security incentives, it's actually just not going to be implemented. I put the probability at 0%. And therefore, I find the suggestion unhelpful, unless the objective of the letter is just to get people talking about this issue and coming up with real solutions. So I'm in this strange position, Dan, where actually I agree completely with your logic that it's probably the answer. It's the solution we should do. I think the timing will never be better. The logic is flawless, except for the fact that it won't be done.
Yeah.
Which is a strange place to be in, where the best possible answer, is just not going to happen. Well, that's why I said I found the mountain thing interesting, because I'm like, well, I could see people actually funding that.
Yeah, I do wonder if there's a unhelpful level of cynicism. For example, I don't think it's necessarily the case that the Chinese government isn't open to deep negotiations on this topic, given that they're behind. Like there's a kind of strange self-serving nature to this comparison, to like this focus on China. And I'm not saying with respect to what you just said, Adam, but I see the way this comes up in conversation, and it's kind of nakedly self-serving in many cases when you actually look at the details of what's happening in China and what the government has announced. And I think I understand kind of where the CCP is coming from on this topic a little better than maybe many of the tech people who are just kind of see them as a black box kind of enemy state racing to grab the ring. So the Chinese government has zero interest in AGI existing. If in their optimal world, it doesn't happen for 100 years. Right now, Xi Jinping and other leaders talk about this as like a Hail Mary kind of solution to some of their, problems of modernization. But in reality, like in my model of the next 10 years, China is returning to the 19th century in terms of its level of geopolitical status. Like China will be wrecked by this transition. It has massive, massive liabilities to a world with free intelligence. Its workforce is lowly educated. Its per capita GDP is low. Its productivity is low. And its only ray of light was trying to get to a more modern tech-driven economy. And the armies of programmers it is training, tens of millions coming out of its universities every year. They are exactly the programmers that are going to be automated soon, right? Its toehold on modernization could just slip. And America is climbing ever higher into the stratosphere in its dominance over the world. That is the future we're looking at as far as I can tell. This is not a good future for China. So like the idea that like whatever their bluster, that behind closed doors they wouldn't be desperate to sign on to some sort of reasonable treaty around this, I think this is, given the relationship and its status, this is maybe very difficult to make work. But, well, it's not like difficult things have never been done before in diplomacy or geopolitics. So I feel like like the level of like lack of ambition around this just reflects the fact that people don't really believe the downsides, right? Like I feel like I believe them, and I think the efforts are like pretty justified to to try and make this work. But on the same level,
that's
Adam,
100% right though. That's 100% right. It's that people don't really believe the downsides. Yeah.
I think did you want to say something, Matt, earlier?
Yeah, thanks. The reason I signed the letter is because I thought 6 months is woefully insufficient, and come the end of the 6 months, the race is back on. It's like, what was the point? But it was like, well, hopefully we quickly agree on a 6 month pause, and then there's nothing more motivating than a deadline. We like somehow we come up with like an actual lasting, sustainable diplomatic solution, like an AI governance. We make some AI governance progress in the 6 months, which is similar to, I think, what something was said earlier. But yeah, and it may be like, I don't think I really was optimistic about it actually happening, but that didn't seem to me to be a reason not to sign the letter. So I think I maybe just have like a gut disagreement with Rish on that point.
Well, maybe one thing that we could put on the agenda for a future conversation is if we were involved. I don't know if you guys are involved. Maybe nobody's called me to join this Manhattan Project yet. By the way, Dan. But what would good regulation look like? What would the content of regulation be? So I'm cynical about solving the alignment problem with respect to AGI and a hard takeoff to ASI, to superintelligence. I'm dubious that is a solvable problem on in any amount of time, that's on any time frame that is comparable to to sort of these 2030 2035 deadlines that we're looking at. I mean, this seems to be, I just don't see enough progress and enough promising leads to have much hope there. However, that's distinct from regulation. So solving the alignment problem is a scientific and intellectual and academic mission. Regulating AI is quite different, and that I think can be quite expansive. Regulation can include a lot of different things. It could include the pursuit of larger, more powerful systems. It could include the deployment of existing systems. It could, include how to manage the fallout and the consequences socially and economically of just automation from the existing technologies that have been developed so far. So that would be an interesting conversation to have, is if you were in charge of regulating these things, what would the regulation look like? And I'm not saying we need to discuss that now, but I would be, if that were the result, if a good proposal for international regulation were the result of a 6 month hiatus, I would be thrilled with that. I should have admitted that part of the scenario as a possibility, and I didn't earlier. I was focused mainly on just solving the alignment problem itself.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. There's been a few interesting discussions about that on Less Wrong. Matt's referring to one of them in the chat. I think that makes sense, although it's so unpredictable where the progress will come from. I mean, my personal model is that scaling continues, limiting that may help, but there are plenty of ways to just increase the density of the current materials and get to a critical threshold, I think. So maybe it doesn't end up necessarily helping, but I think it's like sane to do so anyway.
Yeah, that's right. It's also not clear that it's also not clear where if you try and smooth out the progress in terms of the parameters, it doesn't necessarily smooth out the progress in terms of the capabilities, because they might kind of appear suddenly, and we might still have those kind of issues.
But I think it's true that, I mean, this kind of governance discussion, until like a few months ago, it was like 4 people on an obscure forum, right? And like a few people here and there, and it is only very, very recently being taken up by a wider sphere of society, and that will take time. And I think that is clearly one of the benefits of a pause. regarding alignment, I think the chances of solving any serious problems on that in 6 months are laughable. That makes sense. And it's not.
Yeah.
We just do not have reliable means of scaling that kind of activity. I mean, even the Manhattan Project itself is possibly one of the best run projects in human history in terms of scientific progress, engineering progress. I mean, Oppenheimer was extremely capable. I just finished reading a history of that over the last few weeks. I think it's like in general, we're just not very good at scaling up progress in scientific domains. So I think it's very hard to imagine that a short period of time will get us from where we are to having anything really substantial to do with alignment. But also, it seems like sane to try.
Yeah, I mean, Dan, we had some correspondence offline from this conversation that to broach to a few of these topics, and I mean, I am all for hurling massive amounts of resources at these challenges. I'm despite the cynicism, the stakes are so high. Let's spend a few $1 trillion on this. There's no reason not to, and every reason to throw Hail Marys at this. Maybe we get lucky with an alignment solution does emerge just from fundamental research. Maybe regulation is adequate. Maybe if we just write big enough checks, people will exit the race satisfied. Maybe some of these competitors will just take $100 billion check and walk away from the game because it's enough. And if that's the price to pay, it's a cheap price compared to annihilation. Fuck's sake. So I'm all for devoting massive resources to this and very quickly, but I do remain, of course, deeply skeptical and cynical in practice. One thing that I think could emerge, and you guys tell me if you think it's relevant, is regulation on the data that are used. I'm really concerned. So, for example, one of the things that concerned me most, I was expecting the cynicism, not cynicism, the self-serving, hypocrisy. That's the word I'm looking for. I was expecting the hypocrisy from Elon Musk, calling for the hiatus and then, of course, announcing a project. What really concerned me, though, is the idea that they would use Twitter's corpus of data for training. That seems to me, this hyper-polarized cesspit of the absolute worst of humanity seems to me to be a recipe for disaster. Much, much better training sets, data sets must exist, at least for language. That's I'm making a little bit of a joke of this, but I'm actually quite serious. I think that one of our high leverage points potentially in this situation is to control the data that are used for the training of these systems. And in the absence of any valid alignment theory, the least we can do is train these systems on nice content instead of nasty content. I mean, maybe it doesn't matter, and maybe a smart enough system can see through the crap just as we can, and we can identify horrible awfulness, and it will be able to do that as well. And this is maybe not necessary. Maybe it's a red herring. But better safe than sorry. Train it on rainbows and ponies, and not on 4chan crap. And maybe the outcome might be a little bit better. And then the other thing to think about is the other thing to think about. The other thing about data, about training, is I'm quite concerned about the training data moving outside of the realm of language. We've talked about how these are no longer really best thought of as large or language models, right? They're not large. The original ones were tiny compared to the big ones now. And they're token prediction systems, and that doesn't have to be constrained to just language. And so I'm very worried about systems that get out there and train just on sensory data from the physical world, because that's that doesn't have values embedded in it the way that human language does. And so if you train a trillion parameter model just on physical data from walking around and looking at and listening to and feeling the world, I don't know what emerges out of that. But an animal's mind is very different than a human mind, and language is a big part of that. And if we are looking at training on data outside of the realm of language, there could be a lot of risks with that, and simply outlawing internationally the training of these large systems on certain types of data would seem to me to be a prudent form of regulation as well. So anyway, these are just ideas, but I would love to have a larger conversation about what wise regulation would look like. And maybe, we have the 6-month opportunity. It might be worth, an open letter or an op-ed in a paper or something like that proposes some key ideas, or an archive paper, or something, or just a post on Less Wrong, or whatever it might be, if we come up with some decent suggestions. So I propose that for a future topic at any rate.
I want to acknowledge something Matt said in the chat earlier, which is my comment about 4 people on AI governance being too flippant, and indeed it was, but what I meant was sort of relatively speaking. So I'm pretty confident there are more people with full-time jobs regulating electrical sockets than there are worrying about AI governance, even today. And so relatively speaking, there's a tiny number. But yes, people have been working hard on this, and now is the time to take advantage of that work and certainly do a lot more of it. I guess we should wrap up, so let me flag 2 things we've discussed maybe for return next week. Speaking more about regulation, so continuing the current topic. I also want to get your take, Adam, and from the rest of you on the prospects of different countries are different over this transition, and it would be a mistake to focus too much on the situation of the Americans high in their perch with, hundreds of thousands of GPUs in their pocket, contently twiddling their thumbs while they wait to rule the world, while the rest of us sit around with wondering whether our land and natural resources will still be of value, and how we fit into some future economy. And discussions around UBI that I see, and sort of like reactions to this transition, where we sort of think of taxing the great minds and giving some proceeds to the losers from this competition in order for them to while away their days contentedly, is all well and good if you actually have the great minds inside your border, but if you don't, then maybe you're screwed. So as an Australian and a potential screwy, I would like to have some sort of discussion around what we should do about that. I can imagine the natural resources will increase in value if we increase our productive capacity. So I think Australia probably goes fine in the next era, just like it did in the globalization era. But then that may not be true for other countries. We talked about China briefly. So I think that's a very important discussion to have as well. So
yeah, I agree. Absolutely. That'd be a great topic.
Any closing words?
No, it's been a great chat. Thanks very much for sharing, gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks, Rich.
Thanks again, as always, Dan. It's been a fantastic session. Looking forward to the next conversation.
Okay, well, stay away from paper clips. See you next time.
Take care.